As soon as you say goblins, they're like, "Well, what kind of nose does your goblin have?"
And not
Mhm.
to mention, we kind of meant like, how do they interact with the other races? That is one of the biggest things you have to consider when coming up with these races. How do other races think about them? Because racism is probably going to be a part of your fantasy stories. There's many ways to hook a reader into your story. One of them is having an interesting fantasy race. So we're going to discuss that, some ideas of creating a unique fantasy race that's interesting and not boring, because we're definitely going to stay away from boring. Before we get into that, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving us a like. We're very small and it helps. And we're trying to help build an indie community and also talk about culture and just having better stories in the culture, right?
I think everybody can kind of draw a conclusion of what we mean by a fantasy race. So, what are some really good examples of some fantasy races? Like, what are some of your favorites? And then I'll talk about some of my favorites.
Well, the basics we have are what, right? Orcs, dwarves, elves, gnomes. Yeah, gnomes. They're dwarves, kind of, right? That's something to discuss right there. And in more in the sci-fi realm, right? Which it's technically a section of fantasy. Uh, I always consider Mass Effect probably the most interesting made-up races, and it's not to say, well, because those are interdimensional aliens, we can't learn anything and then apply it to just like a fantasy race that where they all share the same world. No, absolutely not. We can definitely learn different something. And from Mass Effect, like some of my favorite, the Asari and the Solarians, and how those races work very uniquely in the Mass Effect world, where we have Asari. They're essentially a parasitic race that can mate with anyone else. If they mate with a human, or they can mate with a human, they can mate with women too, which is interesting, right? They can mate with literally anything, any other race, even the Solarians. Uh, but the baby that comes out will always be another Asari, which makes them parasitic, which is just such an interesting thing.
I'm glad you brought up Mass Effect Bats because the Krogans are one of my favorite. Another important distinction is the similarities between aliens and fantasy races in general, because I think they're basically the same thing. Um, as a fantasy author, if you come up with a bunch of different fantasy races to populate your world, I don't see what's the difference between Tolkien and, like, say, Star Wars, aside from the many different the many more different aliens in Star Wars, right? It's kind of the same idea. One's just set in space, the other's more medieval.
Well, great to learn from Star Wars, the greatest example of kind of what to do that's going to lead to boring creations, right? Now, boring's not usually tied to Star Wars, but all the races, there's really nothing unique to them, or at least interesting enough that's something like on the side of Mass Effect. But there's something cool, wacky to look at, right? And that's kind of the draw for it. But everything else from Star Wars, it's the story that attracts people to it, not the actual races. Whereas in something like I said with Mass Effect, those races draw you in.
Some fantasy examples. I mean, right off the bat, some people might not consider this fantasy. It's a little bit more urban modern fantasy, but Lovecraft's Deep Ones. I think I'm going to keep bringing those up. Lovecraft's Deep Ones, things like the Dragonborn or half dragons from Dungeons and Dragons, as you can see here. Orcs, shout out to the orcs. Some of the greats, kobolds get an honorable mention. Goblins are a nice one. And all these things are just very alien. To tie it in with some of our past videos, very not human, right? Not human features about these things that differentiate them, but they do have one similarity. Can you guess what that is, Bats? No, they're all bipedal. They all stand upright. They're all humanoid, right? A lot of them. I think this is where we can mine some good potential for future authors, is if we can keep that non-human aspect of it and deliver that alien fantasy race vibe. But maybe figure something else out other than bipedal, because that is still very human. A lot of people would argue that that's just human with, extra.
Well, yeah, you're saying something that's so different from the norm, and that's always going to be something that's more interesting, something that's different from the norm, right? I mean, even centaurs. Like, we don't have any centaurs in things, right? Mainly because they pop up maybe too many interesting, weird, interesting questions trying to think about them. But let's talk Tolkien for a sec, right? We can't talk fantasy races without talking Tolkien. It's just impossible, right? So elves, I've always found boring. Not necessarily Tolkien's elves, but it's because they're humans with pointy ears. But that's not, Tolkien wasn't trying to make something incredibly unique. But Tolkien adds a lot more interesting stuff to the elves, and quite frankly, like kind of the distinction with the humans. I mean, humans are the only ones that able to die. Like that's a interesting distinction. Like the immortality is normal, but sometimes in a lot of fantasy races, immortality is just they don't die from age, but they can die from a stab. Tolkien, their body can die, but the elf doesn't actually die, right? And there's the interesting fact of their age and the world around them. There's a lot more other little subtle things that's added to Tolkien stuff that does give it that interest without having this visually different looking aspects.
Yeah, when you take a look at Tolkien's elves, like a second glance at them from a more like realistic adult perspective of like, I don't know, when you think of the word elf, right? Like, first off, we got to get rid of the Santa Claus elf and the Keebler elf type bullshit if we're going to talk fantasy elves. I mean, that is a viable thing, I guess. Toadstool elves, we could call them. But yeah, if you take a second look at them, they really kind of seem a little bit like angels, right? Like, what else would they be?
Kinda.
Like, and they have this magic that can affect the world, and like they're clearly like favored. I mean, even though they are mortals with free will, maybe a better term would be like a good Nephilim, to use Bible terminology, or like some sort of like Hercules type figures where they're like half here and half there, so to speak. But yeah, rewatching the old animated Lord of the Rings, I couldn't help but get kind of that vibe with some of the more direct depictions of the elves. Is like they're not necessarily ethereal, even though they are, right? They're not like ghosts, right? But but they're like kind of like angelic. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Oh, absolutely. Like the big thing that separates them is the history that's put into it, right? But not everybody's going to be Tolkien. Nobody is able to even conceptualize the amount of history that Tolkien put in. So, like I said, or like we're kind of getting to, it's if that's not the route they can necessarily go through, then again, make them more interesting with personality features. Don't make them just humans. And that's why we also have a video discussing evil races, how you should make some races, or maybe you should, it's a suggestion, have like a pure evil race, and why that is more interesting, because otherwise, if every race is just a human race and they just look a little bit different, that's boring, right? Which is the core of this video idea. But interestingly enough, you mentioned that it's like, yeah, everybody takes their influence of elves typically from Tolkien, and that angelic aspect is exactly what he was going for. And with D&D, it's funny because you have elves, you have high elves, and then they have like the Aasimar or whatever they're called, and they're like half angels, and it's like, dude, that's what the elves are supposed to be there for. So it's like in the creation of the Aasimar, you're almost just, solidifying your elves as nothing but boring, right? They're not, I'm sure great writers can take the elves from D&D and make them more interesting, but typically speaking, if you go into like a game like Baldur's Gate, you're going to just see the elves, and even how they're written,
they're just humans.
Yeah, them being an elf doesn't add that anything interesting, right?
They're superior humans, bats. They can move faster, they have the eyesight, they sleep half as long. That's all they are in D&D. And that is kind of lame, and I can see why so many people make the jokes whenever like superiority is brought up within fantasy races, right? They make that's where the elves get those jokes from.
Typically you only see it's like elves are stuck up, and that's something to make them different, that at least there's something different about them.
The Khajiits are like outcasts of society, so you'll like never see them in town, like, and that's a small detail, that's like passive world building. But then you'll see caravans of them outside of town, because that's how they survive. They're like almost got this gypsy lifestyle.
I mean, that's what they kind of do, is they kind of are like, okay, the Khajiit are going to be the gypsies, right? And so you just steal a lot of gypsy aspects and then throw it onto this fantasy race and kind of incorporate that to make them culturally different from the other races in there. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. All coming up with an original idea is very difficult. That's why it's like you have a race that's more like, some people will make the elves like the Japanese, right? And that will be very different from like the more European influence of the human race, right? So again, maybe it's not so much just making them so much different from real people, just making them different than the humans that are in that specific story that you're writing or whoever's writing.
Yeah, because a lot of times when you just kind of give a very non-human thing kind of a human quality, when you personify it a little bit, like imagine if instead of Khajiit they were like squid people,
Hmm.
but they had like a gypsy lifestyle, and you figured out how to blend that in a creative way. That's kind of interesting. Now you got these things that don't even look human at all, but they behave like gypsies in some way, and you've written that, so it can work sometimes, but yeah, like it can also come off as lazy, and it can become a pitfall if you're just like, oh, and here's my Scottish people, and here's my English people, and here's whatever, here's my samurai Japanese people, and whatever.
Hmm.
I think it's a lot better when you instead think of, if you think of non-human qualities, exaggerate them, and then just have them on some sort of level where they can still interact with humans. Like Star Wars does this good sometimes. I think they have like one of the Jedi they show every now and then is like nobody can ever understand what they say. I think this is kind of actually goes back to Chewbacca, right? Is like nobody understands what he says or anything, but he actually blends nicely into the world just based on people's reactions to him and stuff like that. And even though he's bipedal and humanoid, he's not human enough to like make us have that like uncanny valley type effect.
I'm going to talk Sanderson for a sec, even though kind of don't like him on this channel anymore. But talking about the singers, the listeners, or whatever the race is called, from the Stormlight archive. Now, there's a good thing and a bad thing to take away from this race, right? Their physical appearance, cool. They're basically very humanoid, but they have unhuman colors to their skin, and they have very shell rockish kind of like almost built-in armor to their body, making them very different. They also are able to switch forms to kind of like switch their personality and habits from time to time. So that's another like interesting inhuman thing that they're able to do. The bad thing is that they're kind of very like dull in personality. So from a story perspective, especially writing or being the one that's listening to the story, it's always really boring to listen to them because their personality is always lacking. It's like, well, that's what makes them different than humans, but at the same time it's like, well, how is that now? Are we gonna have focus characters with this? Because I don't, it's okay, it's side characters, but I don't want to focus on this character. So then you're gonna have to consider what you're gonna do with these races and if you're gonna make them protagonists or something to think about.
I'm glad you brought that up, because my novel here, I originally started the book from this guy's perspective right here on the back. Zith. That's the name of this character, Zith. The original first chapter of this book was from his perspective, and I cannot tell you how difficult it is to try to authentically write from a non-human perspective. I have to give props to anybody who tries to do that and actually pulls it off in a really good, meaningful way. And I do break away chapters in here. Like I got chapters basically from everybody's perspective here, but it's only one short and sweet special chapter. My whole point is jumping into this next person's head and just thinking about how, because the whole point of it was to get their perspective. And part of that is like a non-human perspective. And part of that is figuring out what the hell that is. And like how are they thinking? How are they talking? How are they wording things? Yeah. You can go endlessly deep into this to the point where they are literally so alien that it's not even comfortable to read. They're so alien that it's not even comfortable to read. Or you just like have to find some sort of compromise where I basically rationalize it like the person who translated this book translated it into English, and that's why they're using certain things that we understand.
Well, I mean, this is a big thing, right? And identifying with the main character, the characters you're following, super important. So that's why it's like kind of important to have a humanish character. This is kind of going against what we're saying about like, yeah, make these races different. It's like, yeah, but then consider that about the point of view character, because if they're very different, it's going to be hard for a reader, watcher to then latch on to these characters because of their lack of humanity and the things you identify with, right? But great for side characters and building that stuff. And that's kind of why like doing the exaggerated cultures as the main influence for these fantasy races is also really good, because that still grounds them in some human level, so you can keep more you're more easily able to identify them. Like, so the version of orcs that aren't evil, right? a lot of people say only create evil orcs. We did a video on that. But yeah, if you have the very like barbarian, angry orcs, but they're not necessarily evil, then you have an orc that you can maybe identify with, but then still feels different from the human characters you have in the rest of the story, right? So that is more of an orc that you can put as a protagonist, right?
You run into the same dangers of being boring as you said earlier, though, right? Like, where is this even different than a human, or is this just a green human with tusks that's more primitive and stronger, right?
Well, that's why I
Like,
say just make sure that there's just a big separation between them, or good enough separation between them and the humans that are in the story, right?
yeah.
Don't put Mongolians in your because if you do the Warcraft orcs, don't put Mongolians in your story then too, because then it's just like, well, how are these orcs different than the Mongolians? But if you don't have Mongolians in your story, then it's like, okay, these orcs are kind of different, kind of interesting.
Yep, the less shades of gray you put in, the more color stands out, so to speak. You can kind of start separating a lot of these things out by their biome, and you can think of the biome that they live in to give them the non-human qualities.
Yeah.
My dwarves have big, round, beady black eyes, pale skin, no hair. They're probably closer to gnomes. I basically fused gnomes and dwarves together and made them kind of realistic. They look straight up kind of like golem creatures, to be honest. And it's because they live in total darkness. Their natural biome is inside mountains and underground, right? Just factoring these things into, and you can start there. Like, you could be like, swamp. What dwells in the swamp, right? And whether that's mixing qualities together to patch together an alien fantasy race that's brand new and altogether unique. Like, I don't know, instead of Dragonborn, it's like crocodilians, right? Something like that.
Well, we know like lizardmen obviously are a very common fantasy race that are incorporated in many stories, but that doesn't mean I mean, that's a good idea, is just taking animals and attributing things from them and putting them into your race. Of course, then you run into potential furry stuff that's going on, but then, you know, maybe pick and choose better and don't make them just humanoid that animal, or whatever that animal is. Just take certain specific aspects, like, I don't know, like the cocooning aspect, right? Like, maybe this person doesn't have antennas, they don't have butterfly wings, but they do have a cocooning stage in their physiology. That's an interesting thing to add to a fantasy race. Let's go through the vanilla WoW fantasy races. We have night elves. Okay, so we have elves, but they're of the night. Are they different enough? Absolutely. They put a really interesting spin on elves in there. Of course, they have high elves in Warcraft, but of course, like I said, more on the boring side. That's fine. You can have some. Look, you can have some boring races, in your story. But the night elves obviously attracts you very much. Obviously, the color scheme is very different. Not only that, but the visuals lead you into more of like, pull you in, saying that like there's more to their history. There's more going on there, and the things that they're surrounded with, and there's so many different interesting things that's surrounding with them, with the living tree houses. Like, all their things that are around them are living. So night elves, and also like they can turn invisible if at nighttime they stand still. Like, there's some interesting stuff there, and then that ties into their history. So that's cool. Orcs. Now, a lot of people say the orcs are boring because they're just aggressive. I like it a little bit different enough for me, especially since it's just their aggression, right? And their like monstrous strength, almost Hulkish, right?
And just since orcs, much like elves, persevere throughout many things, they went the forest route with the elves. The orcs, it's important to mention, are kind of just like aliens in this case, right? They're literally from a different planet and come through a portal, and that's their origin. Is they're like
what I'll
aliens.
Say with that is that's something that you have to dive into to figure that out. That's not something that's on many and most of the stories, is that lore that's aspect to it. So that interesting aspect to them is not like tied in to the direct influence, direct storytelling of them. Yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a weird point, but I think
like their personality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we got the trolls. So the trolls are Jamaicans.
They are.
I loved playing a troll character in Warcraft, but again, they are on the more uninteresting side. Like I said, there's no problem with having uninteresting, some boring designs, as long as there's other things to grab you in. And in Warcraft's aspect, it's like, well, some of the races aren't interesting, but some of them are really interesting. The undead.
Aren't the trolls they're basically Jamaican goblins with extra steps? They're very goblin-like.
Yeah, and tall. Yeah, very tall. The other thing is too is that the history of these races is what kind of makes them more interesting. You got goblins. Oh, that's not been out. Wow, but they're just Jews. Like
That's what
they're
everybody
just
is
Jews.
going to joke about every single time. As soon as you say goblins, they're like, well, what kind of nose does your goblin have?
Yeah.
And man, it's like, I just dodge that by grounding it in science. It's like, you want to know what mine are? They're little orcs, okay? If the orcs are just hairy, giant, crazy people that evolved in the Arctic, the goblins are those people if you put them on an island and, like, let them sit in a tropical island environment. As we know, islands make things smaller. There's tiny elephants that exist in real life, and there was actual, like, hobbit people that existed in real life. And it's because of like being on an island. So you take something like an orc, put it on an island long enough, you get goblins, in my opinion. So
Then you got you got the gnomes and the dwarves, and in this it's like they're both like technology based. Like the gnomes are a little bit more magical. There's really not much difference between the gnomes and the dwarves in this, and then you got to look at how much different are they than the humans, and it's like really not. And you got to look in order to find the differences. You have to look deep into the history. I mean, the dwarves live in the mountains. That's pretty much it. And I'm like, okay, it's not that much interesting. But again, it's okay to have some boring ones if you mix it in with some interesting ones.
that's true. And is there really a difference between gnomes and dwarves at the end of the day? It would be cool. Like, one thing that jumps out at me is you could put dwarves in mountains and gnomes underground, because those are two different things. I guess the important thing is interesting. Interesting characteristics, abilities, biomes, and things that are as far from human as possible, but possibly still human enough where it can be a protagonist. But it's okay if your races are so alien that you can't make a protagonist, because, like, how could I make a deep one, like a Lovecraftian deep one, into a protagonist? Very difficult. It was very difficult to do a reptilian, just the way they're thinking and stuff. It's going to be difficult to do like a bird person. Like, it's all difficult. How do you do a mantis? Like, what are bugs thinking? Probably won't be able to do that as a protagonist either. So maybe a few core races. Like, for me, it's the reptilians, orcs, and humans. Those are like the core races. If I don't have any other protagonists, I think that's fine within a fantasy world.
Yeah, basically, I'm making my elves bird people.
Yeah,
That's what they have. They have like arm wings, and that's not like completely original, but it's something. It's something a little bit different. Just because I trying to steer away from that typical like, oh, they live longer than humans and they have pointy ears and they're a little stuck up. It's just like that's. I mean, there's so many humans, and even in the stories that we see written, but like with elves, it's like the humans have their own stuck up people too. It's like they don't really seem much different at all.
I think what crossed my mind. You mentioned the bird people as your elves. That reminds me of one of my original elf ideas, and it's still on the table. Like, I never took it off the table.
Hmm.
The deep ones almost took it off the table, but I mean, I still could have like.
More is better.
You're right. I still could have like a more amphibious humanoid of the sea, where they're and then those could be like my elves, and then you can kind of get a nod to the pointing ears if it's just like gills or a fin.
Hmm.
Like, my merfolk could double as my elves, so to speak. A lot of people view them as like the forest, though, and I'm kind of starting to run out of biomes.
That's all token influence.
Yeah,
It's all token influence. It's
I
because
know.
of Token really loved his woods and he liked
Yeah,
his elves, and
yeah.
that was the combination right there.
Mermaids are kind of elfy, if you ask me, buddy. Don't they kind of look like elves, except for the
What?
fish part?
It's because a lot of people put pointy ears on things. What do you,
You're right,
but wait,
you're right.
wait, what? How are mermaids elfy?
I don't know. They got kind of an elf vibe going on. I don't know. Maybe I should dive into like the origins of elves before I like actually make a decision.
Yeah, like we keep mentioning, history to your fantasy race is extremely important, and not to mention we got like how do they interact with the other races? That is one of the biggest things you have to consider when coming up with these races. How do other races think about them? Because racism is probably going to be a part of your fantasy story, especially with whatever time period it is. I just like if you just got all these mixed races and everything like that, and there's not even a little bit of racism going on, the story is probably going to be really fucking boring. It's just there's just no way that's not going to happen that in that way. Like, dude, fucking, I'll what does Gimli say?
I'll be dead before I'll see the ring in the hands of an elf or something like that.
Yeah, and just that little racist remark is a hint to the history of the conflict between the elves and the dwarves. I don't want to like sink into this pussy fucking kumbaya world where everyone just gets together, together and works together. It's like, dude, people are tribalistic. Maybe you're a fan, like you have a fantasy race that isn't tribalistic, but some of them are probably going to be tribalistic. Probably most of them, and there's going to be conflicts created through that, like that, because it's happened upon our history, just in every sense of the word.
Well, like historically, one of the defining reasons for called cultural and regional racism and stuff isn't necessarily just because of like the color of people's skin. You can see this in like something as small as like the British Isles. You know, you got deep racism between like Ireland and Scotland and even Welsh. You know what I mean? And like this stuff just forms over time, even if you look the same. You know, it could be something as simple as there's mountains dividing you, and you don't like those people on the freaking other side of those mountains because all they do is eat cheese all day and sing songs,
Dude,
and whatever it is.
Humans have such a long history of racism just based off the fact that our skin color is different. Imagine if we had like different lifespans, different brain shapes, different arms,
Mating habits,
eating habits.
eyeballs, just eyeballs.
Imagine if you had big differences like that. Like, you don't think the racism would be a little bit worse?
A lot bit worse.
A lot bit worse.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, yeah, but then you could double down and have I don't know, let's just say the cleric character who loves everybody. There would always probably be those activist people within those worlds still.
Yeah, there's probably gonna be activists, and they'll be the first ones to be killed by the other racist in the world.
Well,
that's
another unfortunate thing is nice people get taken advantage of. Nice guys finish last. So like, yeah, those deep ones that you're so pro life for, pro deep one rights. Oh boy.
The nice races always get taken advantage of, right? Think Dragon Ball Z.
Yeah.
Remember the planet of Saiyans? There used to be a smart race there that, got decimated by the Saiyans. Hey guys, if you made it this far, we really appreciate it. And again, please consider subscribing and helping grow this channel. And check in on our live streams, 9:30 Eastern PM, every Tuesday. We always advertise a lot of indie projects that are going on, a lot of stories, because we know that the culture right now, there's a lot of terrible things going on with story writing, and there's a lot of indie creators that aren't going to screw you over, like terrible authors like Brandon Sanderson. And check out, we both are authors ourselves. I'll have a link to my book, which is essentially Harry Potter meets Office Space. It's a comedy, of course, because it's like Office Space, but it's in a fantasy setting. So if that interests you, check it out. AC?
And there'll be a link to my book as well. It's called Mortal Descent. It's an anthology series set in my gritty world of RK, where you can kind of delve deeper into some of these topics that we discuss in these videos in a realistic but fantastical way at the same time. Keep your eyes peeled for A Promise of Starlight coming early this year. I'm almost done, about halfway done editing it here. So yeah, sub to Iron Seas and check out our stuff. Dive in.
Check out our main channels, Battsauce and Pritchard Pub for him.
Yes. Pritchard Pub, Battsauce. Leave a comment below. Let us know how we did, what you think. If how you would make a fantasy race interesting, like what kind of characteristics, how human you think it should be, that kind of thing.
Yeah, throw your opinions in there. And later.